Okay, so we're now recording and I will introduce our first speaker, Michael Perkins.
Thanks, Francisco. I appreciate the introduction very much and the support Jane and I have had over the last little while as we've developed the idea of this clinic from its early concept to now a robust business and professional offering. I'm going to focus in this first part on giving you an introduction to the operating framework of the clinic. And then Jane will follow, going into more of her side of the mechanics of the evaluations from her point of view. We'll finish off with some reminders. And then, as Francisco said, we're very happy to take questions as we go coming through. From my point of view, the most common question I get is, why is a lawyer actually working with a neuropsychologist? And the simple answer is, for all the law around capacity in whatever context it is, the imponderable question is, after you're told all about the things you have to prepare for, capacity is decision and situation specific. That's what this clinic is focused on. Context-specific evaluation of capacity and the education that can flow from that. So instead of a disclaimer, we've got a description of why is a law firm leading the operation of the clinic. It's simply that both the lawyers and the medical professionals recognised that in the approach that we're taking a multidisciplinary approach to capacity assessment. So Autonomy First Lawyers is simply the operating vehicle for the medico-legal assessment clinic that Jane and I are operating. So the purpose of the clinic is to platform the blended medico-legal services that we have. So the fact that there is a blended service concurrently seated means that people get the opportunity to use the client or patient's understanding of legal issues to actually assess their capacity. It's also possible for us to do decision support and supported decision-making construction around particular problems, diagnoses, or situations that a client may have. We support the use of supported decision-making as a methodology of advice and care, but we also are a supporter of Capacity Australia and its learning and teaching around the concept and challenges of capacity assessment. Our focus, however, is on the practical application of professional practices and standards that deal with this decision and situation responsive problem. You probably know that we have the NDIS. NDIS came from the recognition that Australia had signed on to the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. That is the game changer in Australia, because up to then, the law simply said you could assume capacity in the normal case. Now, the federal law says that you have to deal with someone in accordance with their ability, not your perception of their disability or impairment. We are moving away from impairment assessment. We have to embrace ability-focused assessment. That is in substantial part about what makes a lawyer and a neuropsychologist comfortable bedfellows. I've learned more about executive brain function in the last 2 years than I ever thought that I would need to know, but it has been a deeply helpful knowledge in my practice as a lawyer. and it's fueled my enthusiasm for the multidisciplinary practice that has emerged. Put simply, if you can establish the client as an autonomous decision maker and you can create convenient evidence of that, you can very quickly and easily assume capacity and move on. So that's why autonomy is important. It allows you to do a quick filter and establish why it's reasonable to assume capacity. That also helps manage professional indemnity risk. The other thing that then does is it makes it also easy to determine the negative case. What is demonstrably out of bounds? Where must attorneys and guardians be involved as substitute decision makers? The problem is that in the middle, research tells us that somewhere between 25 and 30% of the population between the age of 55 and 85 is going to have mild cognitive impairment. We need to be able to scaffold people's decision-making and keep them in the centre of the discussion about their affairs if we're going to have any hope of complying with community expectations around supported decision-making, let alone scaffolding a response that mitigates the risk of elder abuse around ageing Australians. So we are open for referral. As Francisco has said, this is a soft launch. We'd like to build up experience. We'd like to build up connections with referring clinicians. We'd like to understand the problems and challenges you see in dealing with complex decision-making around clients' affairs and healthcare. We're interested in what you're seeing in the current turmoil, and it may be that the capacity problem that you have is with someone trying to act as someone's attorney or guardian inappropriately. So part of the role that we have in the clinic is to educate people about the appropriate roles around an aging patient or family member. Put simply, we help families row in the same boat. MQ Health is the clinic administrator. The contact details are here. Please contact the clinic for any inquiries about our availability. We are happy to take consultations by video link. I wish I had some shares in Zoom, but I think we need to make sure that we make ourselves as available as possible. The face-to-face consultations will have to be subject to, obviously, the public access rules that are emerging as this current crisis continues. But we will be as available as MQ Health allows us to be within the policies that they have to follow. Both Jane Loney and I are available. Jane is an allied clinician with MQ Health and Macquarie Hospital. We are happy to deal with the simple and the complex when it comes to this field. Where does this start? If you've got concerns or a client's got concerns about their ability to make a decision, if there's a need for informed consent, if there is a dispute within the family about someone's ability to make a decision, if there's a concern about medical consent, what we have found is that it generally takes 1 to 2 hours to unpack these problems and then give you an early stage evaluation report. So we're standardising that on an outpatient fee of $990 paid at the time of consultation. But for that, you get not only the consultation and the advice in the course of that, but also a formal report to summarise relevant outcomes and pathways. So this consultation is a two-step process as far as the patient's concerned. We take a pre-briefing from the referring clinician or the patient's family or carers. We have to spend enough time with the client to get to know their situation, build up some rapport. Depending on the complexity of the presenting situation, that first standard service may well only take us partway down the pathway to resolving the concern of the client or the presenting problem. We will keep the patient or client and their family or supporters informed as to what we can achieve in what time frame. Depending on the presenting problem, capacity and capability assessment can't necessarily be a fast, quick fix or diagnosis. But we will give you feedback and insight in the presenting situation and attempt to resolve the challenges brought to us as quickly and efficiently as possible. But please be aware that underlying complexity may well take the presenting problem outside the realm of a standard service. When talking about what is the usefulness of the clinic, one of the first things Jane taught me as a journeyman lawyer with a bit of neuropsychological background is that when you go into mild cognitive impairment, the first thing to go is inside. So if the client can't understand why they need help, that may well in and of itself be an indicator of an issue for evaluation. For the clients that might simply be challenged by, oh, terribly sorry, you've got a diagnosis of dementia or Parkinson's or motor neurone disease. Capacity is not time, situation, or diagnosis bound. At that point, they may need help to understand the consequences of what they've just heard. They may need help to understand what's available in terms of representation, support, and what is the role of their family in the journey that they are about to go on. So in this regard, we are there as much to support and scaffold the decision-making of the family and as for the care for the individual, but that has to be approached with great care. Supports for decision-making are a new set of tools, but what we have found to date that a lot of professional practice falls into this field of decision-making supports. Part of the outcome of the clinic is to actually start to codify good practice around supported decision-making, to move beyond a binary concept of do you have capacity, yes or no, to do you have the capacity and capability to achieve what you want to achieve. Central to the practice at the clinic is a person-centered, strengths-based practice where we are trying to improve the ability of the client to cope and advocate for themselves. Where that can't be done, we need to put scaffolding around the decision-making of attorneys and guardians. And guardians and attorneys don't have to just act as as substitute decision makers. Attorneys and guardians can act as supported decision makers if they wish. There's just not the legal compulsion around it. So for families and representatives to understand those options is very important. And because Jane and I will be working together, we can give people a blended view of these issues and how they can help the situation of the client. Hopefully that gives you a sense of what does the clinic experience look like. Now we need, I think, to give you a bit more of a sense of the patient's journey and what we need to be watching out for from the patient's point of view. My part in this section is simply to flag a aging is not a simple process. Clients are challenged by complexities in their life, and the need to focus on complex decision making is something which we need to be alert to, because that's where people's capacity to make decision can be overwhelmed by complexity. So here are simply 9 risks around clients that can trigger a concern about capacity, ability, and drive a need for help. Now with that, I'll turn over to Jane to take you further through the slides. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Michael. So as Michael indicated, just going to focus a little bit more on the patient journey. And just for a start, Michael mentioned a number of triggers that may, I suppose, give rise to the need for support for decision-making and capacity evaluation. And they may, I suppose, come across a referrer's desk, depending, of course, what stage the issue's at, in terms of a range of questions around different forms of legal capacity. And some of these are potentially more commonly seen and dealt with than others. And I suspect many will be familiar with or would have come across the need to look at, for example, financial management capacity of a client, or a client's capacity, particularly in the medical field, to consent to treatment or a particular procedure. And equally as common, a capacity to appoint an enduring power of attorney or a guardian. So what are some of the reasons that a patient or a client might need help with their decision making? Well, firstly, because the decision, as Michael alluded to before, the decision that you're being asked to make is outside, it's not particularly familiar area of expertise for you, or indeed it may just be a very complex issue that you're having to deal with. You might need help with decision making because you're not certain about the wider impacts of that decision, or what that's going to mean either in the shorter or longer term for yourself or for other members of your family. You might be unsure about your decision-making capabilities yourself, or indeed, perhaps even more commonly, it's the case that a family member may have some reservations or concerns. And indeed, unfortunately, that can often be the root of conflict then among varying family members about that decision. Of course, where an individual's decision-making capacity is diminished for whatever reason, there may be a concern that a legal decision or a financial decision that's made will later be challenged and will lead to further conflict. For example, in the case of a will or in the case of financial gifting. It may be that a decision has already been made and has resulted in conflict within the family as a result of different family members having different views about that decision and whether the individual had the capacity and the support necessary to make it. Without wishing to go, I suppose, too deep into any individual case, I am going to run through a particular patient who I first came across last year. The matter's still ongoing. Just as a means of, I suppose, trying to illustrate some of the functions and I suppose the touch points for potential referral to the clinic. This gentleman was in his early 70s, and he was a vet, and he ran his own practice, and he came along to me in the context of being investigated by the Veterinary Board for malpractice. Having been seen neuropsychologically, it eventually, unfortunately, led to a diagnosis of early stage frontal variant frontal lobe dementia, which then gave rise to the opportunity, of course, you know, to reach, with further investigation, to reach a firmer diagnosis. And for that patient and his family and supporters to then develop an understanding of what that meant in terms of current symptom management and prognosis and what would be required in the future. And there was the issue as well in this particular case, given the family background of genetic counselling. I suppose in a more immediate sense, it gave rise to questions around this gentleman's work capacity. Was there any capacity, for example, for him to continue to work in the practice in perhaps a lesser or a different role? And outside of a work context, how was he doing? This gentleman lived alone. What was his functional capacity like? What were his support needs? Were they being met? And then, of course, the issue of driving safety. The issue then arose of enduring power of attorney and appointments of enduring guardian, and many different attorneys in this situation had been appointed over the course of the past 24 months, and there was unfortunately a good deal of family conflict around that. So there was a need in this gentleman's situation to identify any barriers to legal capacity, to be able to then be in a position to provide the necessary support for his decision making in those areas. And in this particular man's situation, because of the background conflict, that did involve a degree of education around supported decision making and family mediation. The business was unfortunately eventually sold, and obviously keeping the patient at the centre of the decision, we needed to really advise in terms of financial and estate planning matters. And then, of course, came the issue of the gentleman didn't have an existing will. And then finally, we've got a lot of really important decisions to be made with the necessary support around what this patient's preference and plans were for both in terms of immediate support needs, but also in terms of what might be appropriate accommodation and advanced care wishes. So, So just hopefully as a means of illustrating really what we're hoping to achieve and what we're hoping to help with is, and Michael's referred to this earlier on, is really to get yourself and your family and whatever supporters you may have rowing in the same boat. So what we don't want are these awkward, complex situations where there are questions around decision-making capacity to end up dividing family and shutting off the support that is available to the patient or the client. So the clinic's really helping for the patient or the client to keep their will and preference as the focus of the concern, and that's Michael something alluded to earlier on as the person-centred approach of the clinic. It may be in some cases it's necessary to help you and family members and supporters to have a better understanding of what might be stopping you or the barriers that might be there, preventing you to make decisions as you have previously done independently. So we're there to help you manage your decision making with support, to make decisions that uphold your own will and preference, as opposed to, for example, the preference of another family member speaking for you. We want to help you remain the driver of your decisions and to drive those decisions for as long as possible with the support that's going to be effective for you to enable you to do that. And I think probably one of the benefits of having worked in this particular area for a number of years is, both from a legal perspective and from my own neuropsychological side, is that you inevitably build up a really rich network of, I suppose, peers and other discipline supporters. So with that, really we're in a great position to help you have a wider, more orderly relationship with any representatives, with agents and any supporters and carers who you already work with. So beyond the, I suppose, face-to-face client-patient experience, there is an educating role. We are here to the extent that it's helpful and necessary to educate clients and patients and their supporters about how to navigate what can be a very complex system with legal and medical input. As Michael's referred to, we are really a means of implementing the practice of supported decision making. We've also been working over the past couple of years on a number of training courses and training materials for professionals and collaborators and referrers in the area of capacity evaluation and supported decision making. And of course, one of the biggest roles in supporting the person making the decision is collaborating with families and supporters. So to do our job well, we need good referrals. It's the same, I think, probably in any field of practice in the medical world. Initially how it works is that obviously there's an inquiry, contacts made, and all of the referrals go from MQ Health to one of us for initial triage. There are referral forms, short forms on the MQ Health Clinic webpage, and also those forms can be found on Autonomy First's website. And we can also email those on request. As mentioned earlier, obviously we're in a bit of a difficult, uncertain time. Ideally, we will have face-to-face consults, but we have to run with whatever regulations are thrown our way. Having said that, we are and have been for some time we're very well aware of the situation and what may unfold, and we do intend to have video conferencing available on request as a result of that and in anticipation of that. And in terms of payment, we do require payment at the time of consultation, and the payment side of things is all handled by MQ Health. So what do we need from referrers to make our job, well, really to allow us to do the best job possible and get the best outcome for the client? Well, at a very obvious level, we need to be able to identify who the client is and contact them. And the client obviously, you know, as a very basic starting point has to, you know, be agreeable to the fee on engagement and to paying at the time of consultation. We need you, to the extent that you can, and to the extent that you've learnt this through the interactions with the patient or client, we need you to help us understand that person and any supporters in their family. So in the context of a will referral, for example, that can sometimes look like a family tree. Now, it doesn't need to be that detailed, but it is likely that in the course of interacting with that patient or client, you've built up at least some knowledge of what their social environment looks like and who the important people are in that patient's life. We do want to know about any relevant medical information, and we do want to know anything that you can tell us about any active or pending legal situations. And when I say medical information, obviously we're most keen to hear about particularly things that may affect cognition and decision-making capability. We want to know the informed consent requirement, and if indeed you do know that and you can let us know what that is, we also need or we would benefit from having a copy of the agreement that's being referred to, because without that it's very difficult for us to get a read on the level of complexity that's required of the patient or the client. To the extent that's possible, and this is going to depend obviously on the interactions that you may have already had with the client or the patient, we want to know about their context, and we want to know about any barriers that might present to the problem that we're trying to resolve. And that may, for example, unfortunately, and it commonly is, a level of conflict and differing views of family members. And most importantly, I would say, please tell us the objectives. Tell us what you want us to do. We need to understand the job to be done. We need to have a very clear read on that to be able to deliver. So I hope that helps in terms of what we're about and the kind of people we'd like to help you with. And the process by which you can refer on. And perhaps I'll open up now for questions.
So Francisco's just waiting to hear what people need to say. From my perspective, Jane, I think it's worthwhile just asking you, what's been the most difficult client that you've had recently?
Okay. Look, without sort of focusing on one person or one client in particular, I would answer that by saying that having done this work for a number of years now, there tends to be a common thread to a lot of the issues that end in conflict or that go on for a long time prior to resolving. And it does tend to stem around two things. One is a lack of understanding of how, I suppose, what the legal requirements are for the different forms of capacity and what the pathways are for resolution of those. So often when I see patients in the initial stages, there's no clarity really around, I suppose, what form of capacity or what decision is in question or how to resolve that. And I think the second, I suppose, underlying theme is, and unfortunately this is the case, that when there is some degree of cognitive change that gives rise to diminished decision-making capacity, the patient themselves and their family and supporters have never had the benefit of really understanding the functional and decision-making impacts of that impairment. So there's often a lack of understanding about what, for example, mum and dad's cognitive strengths and areas of difficulty are. And it can be as simple as resolving that and reaching a common ground on that. As a means of, I suppose, coming to some agreement about what level mum and dad can contribute on and how we can help them to remain at the centre of the decision. So I think a lot of the conflict can stem from misunderstanding and not having had the opportunity to, I suppose, be adequately informed from both the legal and the medical side.
Thanks. My 2 cents worth for what it's worth is that what I see very often is people don't understand the depth of responsibility that they may have as an attorney or guardian. I've lost count of the number of times someone said, oh, you've got to talk to me because I've got the power of attorney, don't talk to mum or dad. That signals a problem then and there. The law has changed this year. Every financial planner in the country is now held to a code of conduct that says that they must evidence the client's informed consent to key decisions that the financial planner takes them through. So this question is very clear. As people are focused on complex decisions, it may include things like withdrawal of treatment in palliative care, complex decisions about chronic debilitating disease, then the need for effective and efficient decision-making around that is rights-driven, that is person-centred, needs to be more generally available in the community. Elder abuse comes generally from there being a divergence in values between the person under care and their supporters. So part of the function of the clinic, and this is what the supported decision-making theme is all about, is helping people to understand care as a shared responsibility. Wherever we see that implemented in our day-to-day private client practice, we see generally successful, happy clients and families. So in these difficult times where people are being thrown into unfamiliar areas, we hope that the clinic will provide a safe harbour for better decision making and create better outcomes for patients, their supporters, their families and their connections. Francisco, is there any other questions at this stage?
Not at this stage. Maybe I'll just highlight a couple of things. You can ask questions either via the group chat, or you can unmute yourself and use your video if you prefer to ask questions that way. I just wanted to make a note that the website will be live sometime in April, but the email address is ready to go. So that's your best way to communicate with the clinic and the practitioners as of today. Any other questions before we wrap up?
I don't know if you can hear, but
yes.
Wondered where referrals are generally coming from.
So the question was, where are referrals generally coming from?
Sure. Yep. So, well, combination GP referrals, referrals from specialists who either don't feel that they have the expertise in the area of evaluation or navigating whatever the legal questions may be, or do and don't want to get involved. Sometimes and often family members themselves who find themselves, you know, sometimes they've already sort of midway down a guardianship tribunal path. Other times they're sort of, facing that as a last option. Solicitors who feel that for whatever reason they're uncertain about a client's capacity. Sometimes accountants, financial planners.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Any other questions from the participants? Michael, did you want to have some closing remarks?
Yeah. Just to reflect on Jane's comment for a second, as a practicing solicitor, I was actually talking to a client a couple of weeks ago about the clinic. It was in a will review, and the client turns around and says, "Oh, can I talk to you about my son?" Turns out the son has had a series of drug and alcohol addiction problems. He is in recovery, but the question the father posed to me is he a competent beneficiary for my will? He's going to get substantial property. And I honestly had to say, no, I don't know. Unless we have an assessment of his decision-making and ability and we understand his range of decision-making, it's impossible for me to advise you as to what kind of a beneficiary he needs to be under your will and what kind of special provisions might need to be made. So that's just an example of ordinary professional practice being able to respond to cognitive challenges in day-to-day practice. And I think that's the core idea we want to leave you with, that we're here to help clinicians across professions deal with the cognitive challenges of clients as they present. So thank you very much for your attention this evening.
Thank you all, and we will make the recording available via a link that you can share with your colleagues. If there's no other questions, we'll end the webinar. Thank you very much.